Hello everyone, welcome to the weekly lecture videos once again. And in this video, we are going to discuss the second learning objective of chapter 3, the ratio analysis. In the last video, we learned about standardized financial statements, and we discussed how standardized financial statement resolve the problem associated with comparing companies of different sizes. So in this video, we are going to talk about ratio analysis, which is another way of avoiding the problems involving comparing companies of different sizes. Okay. These ratios are ways of comparing and investigating the relationships between different pieces of financial information that we obtain from financial statements. One problem with ratios is that different people and different sources frequently do not compute them in exactly the same way, which leads to much confusion. So we will learn some specific definitions, how we calculate these ratios and the use of these ratios, okay? So once again, the ratio analysis will help us comparing company performances or company financial positions over time across companies. Okay, we can see internally how they are performing, and also they can be used by external analysts. We will shortly see that how ratios are calculated and how ratios are used. But at this moment, some problems that come up while using these ratios will be discussed. And we see in this slide that some questions that come to our mind when we will be discussing these ratios. First of all, like how it is computed and what is it intended to measure. That means what does a ratio measure and why we should be looking at this ratio. What is the unit of measurement? In each ratio, there will be numerator and the denominator, and there will be a resulting unit of measurement. And we will also be interested that once we calculate this ratio, whether higher the ratio or lower the ratio tells us some information or give us some insights, and also whether these measures can be improved. Okay, so now we will try to cover these questions when we discuss individual ratios under different dimensions. There are numerous ratios that are used and calculated by financial analysts. These ratios are divided into these 5 major dimensions. Okay, they are short-term solvency or liquidity ratios, long-term solvency or financial leverage ratios, asset management, profitability ratios, and market value ratios. We will be very briefly discussing the ratios under each of these 5 dimensions. So first of all, liquidity ratios. As the name suggests, short-term solvency or liquidity ratios essentially measures the ability of a firm to pay its bills when they become due. Okay, so which means that these ratios essentially measures a firm's liquidity, ability to pay its short-term obligations using its short-term assets. Liquidity ratios are particularly interesting to short-term creditors, and since financial managers are consistently working with banks and other short-term lenders, an understanding of this ratio is very important. One advantage of looking at current assets and current liabilities is their book values and market values are likely to be similar, right? Often, these assets and liabilities just do not live long enough for these two values to get seriously out of step. On the other hand, like any type of near cash, current assets and liabilities can and do change fairly rapidly. So today's amount may not be a reliable guide to the future. Okay. The first liquidity ratio that we usually look at is the current ratio, which is calculated as current assets minus, you can see current assets minus current liabilities, okay? For example, if a company has current assets of 708 and current liabilities of 540, then current ratio is 1.31 times, okay? Now, what do we learn from these current ratios? So we learned that a company having a current ratio of 1.31 means that the company's current assets are 1.31 times of current liabilities. Its current assets exceeds current liabilities, and they are 1.3 times. Okay. Which we can say, in other words, that the company's liquidity position is reasonably good because it has enough current assets to pay out its current liabilities. From the perspective of a creditor, particularly a short-term creditor, such as a supplier, the higher current ratio is the better one. Okay. For the firm, a high current ratio indicates liquidity, but it may also indicate an inefficient use of cash and other short-term assets, as such assets are generally on low return. For example, if current ratio of a company is 5, its liquidity position is good, but that might negatively affect its profitability because the firm is holding too much current assets and that earns less return. Except in extraordinary circumstances, we would expect to see a current ratio of at least 1, because current ratio of less than 1 would mean that net working capital, which is current assets minus current liabilities, is negative. These would be unusual in a healthy firm, right? Current ratio is affected by various types of transactions. For example, suppose a firm borrows over the long term to raise money. The short-term effect would be an increase in cash from the issue proceeds and an increase in non-current debt, right? Current liability would not be affected. Okay, so the current ratio would rise. The next one is quick ratio. So a quick ratio is current asset minus inventory divided by current liability. So if you compare between current ratio and quick ratio, you can see in both cases your denominator is current liability, but in quick ratio we deduct inventory from current assets. Okay. So it means that quick ratio measures a firm's liquidity position or firm's ability to pay out its liabilities without relying on inventory. Okay. Now you can say, okay, why do we do it without relying on inventory? Inventory is often the least liquid current assets, right? And it is also the one for which the book value are least reliable as measures of market value, since the quality of the inventory is not considered. Okay, and some of the inventory may later turn out to be damaged or lost. And more to the point, relatively large inventories are often a sign of short-term trouble. The firm may have overestimated sales and overbought or overproduced. In this case, a firm have a substantial portion of its liquidity tied up in slow-moving inventory. Okay, that's why a firm's actual liquidity position should be based on current assets without considering its inventory. So you can see how we calculate current quick ratio. And final liquidity ratio that we consider is the cash ratio, right? So cash ratio is the cash divided by current liabilities. So once again, the denominator is same. So cash ratio is the firm's liquidity position or the ability to pay out its obligation based on the level of cash it has. Okay, so a very short-term creditor, for example, those who are lending us an overnight loan, probably would be interested in this cash ratio because an overnight loan will be repaid based on the available cash. Okay. So these are the liquidity ratios, and this is how we interpret these ratios. The next one is long-term solvency measures, and they are also known as financial leverage ratios or simply leverage ratios. Okay. Um, these ratios are intended to address a firm's long-run ability to meet its obligation, okay, or more generally, its financial leverage. So try to understand the difference between the liquidity ratios that we discussed in the last slide and the long-term solvency ratios. The liquidity ratios measure a firm's ability to pay its short-term obligations, whereas these long-term solvency ratios measure a firm's ability to pay out its long-term debt or long-term obligations. Okay. The first one is the total debt ratio, which is total asset minus total equity divided by total asset once again. So for example, a company has a total debt ratio of 0.28 times. So total debt ratio takes into account all debts of all maturity to the all creditors. Okay. Now, look, the debt ratio of a company is 0.28 times or 28%, which means that this company is 28% of its total asset is financed by debt, okay? Or 28% of its funding is from outside creditor, okay? Now, whether this ratio is higher or lower, that's difficult to say just looking at this ratio. So we possibly can compare it with other relevant firms or an industry benchmark. We will be discussing about this point more detail later. The second long-term solvency ratio is debt to equity ratio. So debt to equity is total debt divided by total equity. And this is also known as equity multiplier. Okay. So for example, you can see that debt to equity ratio is 39 times. Okay. So this debt to equity ratio essentially indicate that for every $1 of equity, you bear a liability of $0.39. Okay, so for example, if you are an equity holder of a company, shareholder of a company, you hold a share, for every $1 of your equity, you bear a liability of 39 cents. Okay, you get it? So the equity multiplier that I just talked about. Okay. The next one is time interest earned ratio, and you can see the formula is EBIT divided by interest or financing cost. So this ratio essentially measures your earnings available to pay out your financing costs, for example, interest. Okay. For example, a company has a time interest earned ratio of 4.9 times, which means that this company is in a reasonably good condition because your earnings is 4.9 times of your level of financing cost. Okay. And the last one is cash coverage ratio, which is EBIT plus depreciation divided by interest. So it means that how much cash available you have to pay out your interest. Now, keep it in mind that we are particularly looking at the ability to pay interest because this is a fixed term obligation, and inability to pay this obligation on time may result in bankruptcy. Okay, and you can see that these ratios are, for example, 4.9 times, 6.9 times, indicating that a company has enough earnings, enough cash to pay out its obligations. So it's an indication of financial soundness. Okay, and obviously, if this time interest earned ratio or cash coverage ratios are lower, this total debt ratio or debt to equity ratios are higher, that will be indicating that a company is more reliant on external debt. It has less ability to pay its fixed term obligations. So that might be an indication that company is in a financial distress condition. The next dimension that we are going to discuss is asset management. or inventory ratios. Okay. Now, these ratios are intended to measure how efficiently or how intensively a farm uses its assets to generate revenue. Okay, that means how efficient you are in generating revenue by using your assets. Okay, so first of all, we look at the inventory turnover ratios, which is cost of goods sold divided by inventory. Okay. And you can see that it's 3.2 times. So cost of goods sold divided inventory, it is 3.2 times. In a sense, we sold off or turned over the entire inventory 3.2 times in a year, right? As long as we are not running out of shares and thereby foregoing sales, the higher this ratio, more efficiently we are managing our inventory, because that will be indicating that we are turning over our inventory more frequently. Okay, we are selling out our inventory more frequently. So higher turnover will be indicating we are more efficient in turning over or managing our inventory. The next one is days sales in inventory, 365 divided by inventory turnover. And you can see that it's 114 days. So these days sales in inventory essentially indicate that how long you take to complete one turnover of inventory. Okay, so what is the meaning of one turnover of inventory? You purchase raw material, you put the raw material in the production process, and you finish goods is produced. That is one inventory turnover. And for example, in this case, it takes 114 days. Okay, so keep it in mind that longer these day sales and inventory means that your inventory is tied up for longer time. Your investment is tied up in longer time. And shorter means you are turning over your inventory quickly. So that will be generating more sales and more revenue. Okay. The next one is receivable turnover, and you can see that receivable turnover is calculated as revenue divided by average receivables, and it's 12.3 times. Like we explained, the inventory turnover ratio, it means that how frequently you turn over your inventory in a year. So for example, it's 2.3 times. So your receivables are created and collected. That's one turnover, and it happens 12.3 times in a year. Okay, and once again, if this ratio is higher, it indicates that your receivable is turned over more frequently, or that might indicate that you are more efficient in managing your receivables. And day sales and receivables turnover is 365 by receivables turnover. So once again, it means that how long you take to turn over your receivables. What does it mean? Your receivable turnover starts as your inventory is sold, then up to you collect your receivables. Okay, so after selling your inventory, how long you need to collect your receivables? And you can see that it's 30 days. Longer these days means you take longer to collect your receivables, okay, and your money is tied up for longer time. Whereas shorter means you are more efficient in collecting your receivables, and that will also reduce your reliance on external financing requirements. The next one is payable turnover. So cost of goods sold divided by accounts payables. And you can see it's 3.9 times. So once again, it means that how frequently your payables are turned over in a year. So payable turnover means when you purchase your raw material, okay? Purchase your raw material on credit, your payables are generated, and then you take some time to pay your payables. So once these payables are paid out, then your payable turnover completes. Okay, and you can see it's 3.9 times. It means that over a year, so your payables are turned over 3 times. Okay, 3 times. Now, whether this higher this value good or lower this value good, once again, that depends on your industry practice. So for example, days cost in payables is 94 days. It means that you need 94 days to complete one payable turnover. Okay. Now, if it is longer, it means that you have more time to pay your payables, right? Which means that you have the opportunity to use this money for other purposes. So so probably you will be looking for a longer the payable turnover, days in payable turnover, whereas shorter means your supplier are selling to you at a more strict credit term, and you are required to pay more quickly. Okay. And last of all is total asset turnover. And you can see that your total asset turnover is revenue divided by total asset. Okay. And you can see, for example, it's 0.64 times. It means that how much revenue you generate for properly utilizing your total asset. Okay, so when it is 0.64 times, it might indicate that by utilizing every $1 of asset, you generate a $0.64 of sales. And obviously, higher this ratio will indicate that you are more efficient in managing your total assets because you are generating more sales for a given level of total assets. Okay. So it might seem that a high total asset turnover is always a good sign for a company, but it not necessarily so. Consider a company with old assets. The assets are almost fully depreciated and might be very outdated. In that case, the book value of the assets is low. Okay, so this total asset in the denominator, that's the book value of the asset, and that will be low, so it will have a higher turnover ratio. Okay, but that might not be good. Plus, the higher turnover ratio also means that the company will need to make major capital outlays in near future. Okay, so a low turnover ratio may seem bad, but sometimes it could be indicating opposite to a company that just purchased a large equipment may have a lower turnover ratio. Okay, but that might indicate that it will increase higher in future. Okay. Capital intensity ratio is 1 divided by total, 1 divided by total asset turnover. The next dimension we are going to discuss is profitability ratios. So these ratios' main purpose is to measure how efficiently a firm uses its assets and how efficiently the firm manages its operation to generate its profit. Okay, so the bottom line is the profit of a period by utilizing its assets. Okay. The first one is profit margin. So profit margin, you can see that profit for the period divided by revenue. Okay, so for example, a company had a revenue of 2,311 and its profit is 385. So its profit margin is 16.7%. So all other things being equal, a relatively high profit margin is obviously desirable because it indicates that for every $1 of revenue, you are efficiently managing your expenses, so you are generating higher profit. Okay. And return on asset is profit for the period divided by total asset. And you can see the ratio is, for example, this. So total return on asset is 10.73%. Okay, so which means that by investing in your total asset, you are generating a return of 10.73%. And obviously, higher this ratio will indicate better because you are efficiently utilizing your assets and generating higher profit. Return on equity is how much return you generate for your equity holder. Okay, so the difference between these two ratios are the denominators. Here it is total asset and here it is total equity. So this return on asset that we just discussed, this is the return available to all capital providers, the equity holders and debt holders. On the other hand, this return on equity is how much return you generate for your equity holders. So for example, it's 14.9%. That is the return available to equity holders or shareholders. Okay. Now you need to understand that why return on asset 10.73% and return on equity is higher than that. So you can see that return on asset is 10.73%. So that's the return available for debt holder, but perhaps the cost of debt is lower. That's why this excess return goes to the equity holder. As a result, return on equity is higher than return on assets. Last of all is market value measure. That's our final group of measures, and this is based on information not necessarily contained in financial statements. Rather, they are depending on market value information or market price of share. Okay, so these measures can be calculated directly only for publicly traded companies. Okay, because for privately traded companies, the market value of share information is not available. So the first the first ratio that we are looking at is market price. So market price is price per share, right? And for example, share outstanding is 35 million. So EPS, that's the first share we are looking at. EPS is profit for the period divided by shares outstanding. Okay, so for example, the profit for the period is 385 and number of share outstanding is 35 million. Okay, so earning per share is $11, which means that the company earns $11 for every share. So if you are a shareholder of a company, your share has a price, for example, say $100 or so. For against each of your $100 share, the company has earned $11. So that is the earning per share. Okay, that's the earning available for the shareholders. Okay, now whether these earning will be distributed to shareholders as a dividend or not, that's a different story, but that's the earning the company earns for each shares. Next one is price earning ratio. So price earning ratio is price per share. Okay, price per share that we have seen here. For example, 88, and EPS is we have just seen here $11. So you can see that price earning ratio is eight times. So price earning ratio essentially indicates that at which price your share is traded and at which multiples your share is traded in relation to its earnings. Okay, so when PE ratio is, for example, 8 times, it means that your share price is 8 times of its earnings, right? So as I said that, for example, you are holding one share, it has a price of $88, and this and the EPS of a company is EPS of the company is $11. It means that you're holding a share which price is 8 times of earning available. Okay. Now, if this ratio is higher, it means that market is paying a higher price for every $1 of earnings. Okay. On the other hand, if this ratio is lower, it means that market is willing to pay only a lower price for every $1 of earnings. Okay. Now, obviously, you apparently think that higher this ratio, the better, because that indicates that the share price is higher compared to its earnings, but sometimes that might be simply overpricing, which is not relevant to the company fundamentals. Okay, when you are buying a share, you probably would be happy to buy a share with a lower PE ratio because you are paying less. However, that might also be indicating that the market is negative about the share. Okay, when PE ratio is lower. Price to sales ratio is price per share divided by revenue per share. That means what is the price a market is charging for every $1 of revenue available for the share. Okay, so for example, it's 1.33 times. That means the share price is 1.3 times of every $1 of revenue earned for the share. Okay, sorry, not every $1 of revenue, for the revenue per share. Market price ratio also is market to book value ratio. So market to book value ratio, you can say market value per share divided by book value per share. Okay. Now, look, this book value per share is an accounting number. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. Book value per share is an accounting number, so it reflects its historical cost. Okay, market value, on the other hand, is the value of the share in the market. Now, in a loose sense, the market value ratio compares the market value of a firm's investment to its cost. Okay, a value less than one could mean that the firm has not been successful overall in creating value for its shareholder. Right. So, for example, if it is 0.9, for example, okay, it means that market value is 90 cents for every $1 of a share. That's a book value, which means that the market value is not enough to cover up the book values. So apparently we will be expecting that market value to book value ratio is higher than one, which will be indicating that the value creation for the shareholder is higher than the cost. We also look at enterprise value to EBITDA ratio. So this is what I am talking about. So EBITDA ratio is enterprise value divided by EBITDA ratio. So enterprise value is calculated as total market value of shares plus book value of all liabilities minus cash. Okay, and for example, it is 3.93 times. Okay, this ratio is similar in the spirit of P ratio, but it relates the value of all operating assets. So that is the enterprise value. So all operating asset to a measure of operating cash flow generated by those assets. Okay. So essentially, this completes our definition of some common ratios. So we will be discussing more about these ratios in the subsequent videos. Okay, thank you very much.